Nevertheless, I will address your question right now, first of all with spelling out what are important concepts that I think people should have. And we're going to do, you're going to hear some shoulds, and whenever I hear myself say should,
sure.
I jump, because in transactional analysis, should is sort of a bad word. It's a word that is used by the parent ego state that's telling somebody you should be doing what you should learn. But nevertheless,
should can be a recommendation as well, and I think let's take it as a kind of recommendation, and the others say have an adult and they can decide on their own whether they take it or not.
That's
but
right.
It's really a gain to get your recommendation.
Yeah. Okay.
After a long life of working in this area.
So, what are the important theoretical tools that counselors, people need as a framework for whatever it is they're going to be talking? And we do know now from research that really a part of Gazenga, and I want to refer to him in that sense, that he has proven from research that one part of our brain is really the interpreter, the logical, the verbal one that explains, but that actually our decisions, our thoughts, our changes occur with another part of the brain, the intuitive part of the brain, and that is rather mysterious, and that's going to be understood much better in 10-20 years when research will have shown better how the circuits operate in the brain. Okay, so in order to talk about these shoulds, I want to step back a little bit. Of course, my background training was psychoanalytic. And what happened was that after years of practicing psychoanalytically, doing individual psychoanalytically presented, psychoanalytically influenced therapy, I decided that my therapy wasn't good, was not effective, did not justify the amount of time and money that was spent on it. And reading Burns' Tea in Psychotherapy, his first book, which I read in 1964, which he published in 1961, but it was not known before. Reading that book changed my whole approach, and everything I have to say in terms of what somebody needs to know is expressed from the perspective of someone who was transformed by thinking from the perspective of Burns' original book. And what was it that transformed me? What was it that I considered so very important and changed me? It was the fact that he stressed that we operate with 3 ego states. That some of what I will say now will sound so obvious to people in 2012, and yet for 1964 it was a revelation. So I will still go with the revelation that I experienced in 1964, even if you, the listener, will say, okay, so what else is new? But this was the revelation. We operate with 3 ego states, and each ego state is a system. This is a definition from Byrne, a system for thinking and feeling that can be manifested by behavior. Behavior includes an expression on the face. Yeah. It isn't behavior acting out. So really the original definition was a functional definition of ego states, and it's the functional ego definition that interests me. Byrne did assume that we had parts of our brain that operated in terms of certain ego states. Nowadays we wouldn't say that, but we might say circuits. Comparing them to the computer, we might say circuits in the brain that operate, that I think in terms of the child circuit, the parent circuit, and the adult circuit. And these circuits, or the potential for these circuits, existed from the time of birth, but continue. And so going back to the revelation is that each circuit continues to exist in the now with whatever material it has accumulated in the course of growing up. Which means by implication that being familiar with developmental child development or human development is very important in terms of any kind of consultation one does with someone in the here and now. The big difference between TA and between the TA and psychoanalytic approach is that TA is a cognitive therapy. It can be thought of as one of the cognitive therapies.
One of the ideas you made it a little bit more clear with your article
That's right.
5 years ago, yeah? And
yes,
it's kind of provocation of the TA society or the TA community, yeah?
Exactly, and the reference should be given of the TA script, the little TA script, which caused quite a furor in the TA community, where some people, like Schlegel, for instance, in Switzerland, who unfortunately is dead now, was enthusiastic and claimed that said that he'd been saying that all along, and a number of other people were very enthusiastic. This was translated into German, by the way.
Yes, I know.
And other people like Novellino in Italy was shocked and took the attitude that I was demeaning TA, I was reducing it, that I was being reductive. Okay. As you may notice, I spin around. The Germans say spinnen, and I don't know what the equivalent English expression is.
Spinnen is a little bit different, but spin around is just so...
And I have lost track a little bit of what I was saying, but I'll continue anyway. The big thing, the big TA revelation is that we have 3 ego states, and each ego state is a system being like a thermostat or an old-fashioned watch, or the kind of system that Fritz Perls talked about in Gestalt therapy, of interdependent parts. And the big contribution is to combine thinking and feeling. All therapies until then used to emphasize the difference or the separation between thinking and feeling. Typically a client, a therapist for instance, would say, well, how do you feel about this? And the client might answer, well, I think you're trying to provoke me. And the therapist would say, wait, that's a thought, that's not a feeling. I'm asking you how you feel about this and not what you think. And this is a ridiculous reaction, because thinking and feeling are totally interwoven. And this Byrne emphasized. So thinking and feeling are interwoven in each ego state. So my ways of thinking and feeling in the child ego state are different than my way of thinking and feeling in the parent ego state. But it's always thinking and feeling combined. And this I think is a major contribution of not trying to split thinking and feeling. Nevertheless, there is some new work by Damasio which I have found very interesting and which I want to include in here. And now people who've read Damasio's book on Spinoza, for instance, are going to accuse me of presenting him very simplistically and erroneously even. I would hate to think of what Damasio himself would say about what I say he says. But I'm going to give you my interpretation of what Damasio says. And he says that emotions exist in, we can talk about emotions in the, for mammals and they exist in all of us, humans and mammals, and the emotions therefore would be located in the more primitive. I'm not going to try and say reptilian or whatever, and I'm not even going to try and be specific whether we talk about the amygdala or whatever. I'm going to say the primitive part of the brain. And emotions exist, and I don't know whether Damasio or others list the typical emotions. I'm not sure I can list them, but maybe, I think fear, anger, joy, I think disgust. I'm sure there are a couple more, and somebody can look them up. And these exist exist in this part of the brain and react. And then emotions or events associated to emotions will travel up in the cortex, up into the cortex. And now we're talking about human beings, and human beings have this enormous range of feelings that they can have, and there again we can talk about thoughts and feelings rather interchangeably. But this process is a very interesting one, and so in talking about in talking with an adult, or we use the word adult in two meanings. A grown up, I'm going to use the word grown person rather than adult. We're talking to a grown person. That grown person has the potential of a wide range of feelings which can be named in all kinds of very refined ways. Just the way the color spectrum can be expanded by an artist to, I don't know, hundreds of different shades of color, but basically there are only, I don't know, again, 4 or 5 basic primitive colors. Okay. So we have these 3 ego states with the potential of a wide range of feelings and associated thoughts, and thoughts that are associated to memories and that relate to memories, some of them potentially conscious and some of them potentially unconscious and affectless. Okay. Where was I now? I'm lost.
We just talked about the concept that a young consultant should know, or a young professional should know, and you referred on you bridged between Byrne and Damasio, meaning you bridged about between over 30 years of scientific research on concepts.
Plus Gazzaniga also. Whom I would like to refer to simply the terminology about the interpreter, the way we describe something which is does not necessarily correspond, even in terms of a trauma or in terms of a happy experience. Why only use trauma? That I will refer to someone and half the time I'm lying even to myself. And I have thought it or experienced it very differently than the way I believe I have thought it out or experienced it.
And for a young consultant, it means he or she has to distinguish between what feelings and thoughts in the same message. Maybe a client would send, and to be aware of it. That even the emotional part on the surface is not the part what kind of emotion is lying really within the message or within the action or within the behavior. And to distinguish it very, very careful and with an open mind.
Exactly. So there's a dilemma, because a client, now we're talking about a young consultant, but we're also talking about the client who would come to the consultant. Or the consultant needs to be aware that the client comes with an expectation of receiving some help about changing something. A client comes for...
Sometimes or sometimes not. Sometimes it comes with a confirmation that the problem is not solvable.
Exactly.
Not solvable,
Exactly, but that is the hidden thing.
Sure.
But the overt reason for coming and paying money in order to work with the new consultant is that I want to change something. The Goldings, who are well known in the TA community, and called their method of therapy redecision therapy, is one of the TA therapies. The Goldings, or Mary Golding, usually started working with a client and establishing a contract. I'll get back to the term, to the idea contract, by saying, what do you want to change? And so her treatment contracts would be based on establishing what the client says they want to change. Now, in the course of working, the client might find that they want to change something different than what they want to change, but that's a different story.
Okay.
But theoretically, a client comes for help in establishing, in modifying something or other. Usually they would rather modify something in the environment or in their partner or in their job than modify something in themselves. But that's a different
part
story.
of the game.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to what a consultant, what a young consultant needs to learn. I think some grounding in developmental theory is very important. Certainly a young doctor, especially a pediatrician, needs to learn stages of physical development. There's a difference. For instance, a child learning to walk, and there are certain markers in terms of age, of at what age do you expect that a quotes normal child walks, about 18 months to 2 years or something. At what stage do you expect that a quotes normal child talks or says words, and so on. In the same way, in terms of emotional development or relations, we need to familiarize ourselves with markers of what are important phases and different ages. And then bringing it back into the idea of ego states. The point is that in the child ego states, I have developed certain patterns and certain ways of being that tie into certain specific ages. And the more familiar a consultant is, sorry about the language, it's very clumsy, but
no,
it's easier to say it in German. That's why I like German. Anyway, the more, yeah, with the verb at the end, it's much easier. Anyway, when the client, the consultant or the therapist or whoever, the counselor needs to be familiar with emotional stages, the so-called, quote, normal. And then there's a huge literature of what is considered, and nowadays there's great emphasis on what they call attachment theory, at what stage you develop this and that and the other. But one credo of TA, of one of Byrne's credos, was to try and make things simple and to make things comprehensible to a 12-year-old. And I think
just to bring it on a level that is understandable, meaning, and that's not to make it, to simplify it, but to make it clear that such kind of person are able to deal with it.
That's
in that
right.
sense, yeah.
That's right. And there's a difference between simple and simplistic. Simplistic is cheap, no good. Simple is very important. There's a quote from Einstein. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I was told that Einstein said or wrote that if you can't explain relativity to a 12-year-old, you don't understand relativity.
And I think that's a sense in it.
And Byrne said something similar, and very often he encouraged his trainees to say, I don't understand, my 12-year-old doesn't understand, and to really see whether the child the child ego can understand what's going on. Okay, so I'm lost again.
Yeah, but to make a loop, that sometimes happened that TA was referred as a kind of Mickey Mouse pathology.
That's right.
Meaning
Yeah.
it's too simple, it's too easy to understand, everyone can work with after a 3-hour training and feel as a therapist. And I think that's completely mistaken. This sentence. It's more going for a high quality what you are of the concepts, and it's not and to bring it on a higher level and not to simplify it or make it simplistic. What, to be honest, lots of conceptualists and theorists with TA have done, and have published. That's right. It's part of the success story of TA, but it's also part of the shadow sides of the back of the moon. That makes it sometimes tough to really use it and cite it and refer on it.
And it's even been my problem too, because this is something we will be talking about at the end, my concept of 3 drives or motivators. When I first started to think or talk about them, my first article on the topic was entitled Sleepy, Spunky and Surly. And I used these simple terms to at the time I thought that I could explain motivators as residing in the child ego state. I no longer see it this way. This was my early attempt to develop that piece of theory that I consider mine and that I'm very proud of and that I can only talk about at the end. But I will put this parenthesis in here that my article Sleepy, Spunky and Surly is often quoted instead of a much later article. And I'm not happy with that because it was published in a psychology journal and it was called Disneyland. And so I was thrown into Disneyland also at a certain point with the basis of the part of my theory that I most value as was originally.
Sometimes it's hard to take things back what you have already published.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So, but coming back to our main roads. Okay. First of all, you talked about how a professional has to distinguish between feeling and thinking, and the second point you made was that you have to know a little bit more about the development of human being, of the psyche, and such kind of concerning the stages as.
And then we have to pick and choose and keep. We now counselors about what has been found more and more in terms of developmental theory in the emotional area. For instance, I have 2 articles on shame, and I was the first person in the TA community to focus on the importance of the fact that our shame receptors, so to speak, start out at about age 2, almost around the time of or before 2, I would say 18 months or whatever, around the time of toilet training, actually. And there we have a certain kind of correspondence to psychoanalytic theory but not exactly, not the way psychoanalytic theory talks about anal kinds of people or oral or whatever it is. But certainly, implicitly, Freud saw that there is something there, that the stage of toilet training corresponds to a particular stage of shaming or shame ability.
But that's the point. We are able to do it,
but what one gets shamed about differs with cultural development, cultures, family development, and so on. But this is an example of how the awareness of development is so useful with the here and now. And one of my best cases that I describe in my first in one of my articles on shame is the case of, I call her Nancy, who was having nightmares suddenly. She was quite well balanced, and suddenly she came for help. And because she showed symptoms of shame in my office as she was talking from the here and now perspective about her nightmare, I was able to help her very fast. I will get back to that because I'm going off on a tangent. But somewhere along the line, I would like people to, I would like to refer to this case of identifying a client who suddenly gets flushed, red in the face in talking to me about how she doesn't remember the content of the nightmare. And from that, I was able to help her very fast in getting rid of the terrible experience she was feeling in the now. Okay, I'm lost again. Start all over again. So what does one need to...
So we have the ego states and the system and distinguish between feeling and thoughts. We have aspects of brain function. We have stages now of human development. And one of the points you mentioned within this context was the ability to shame and how it will be used or misused in the time when we grow up and when we are raised up by parents or by the environment, social environmental.
This, for instance, I'm using this as an example to show, for instance, in working with trauma.
Okay.